Although Britain was at war, there was very little sign of it in the fields and lanes of Kent, Surrey, and Sussex during those early days of August 1940. The hedgerows were thick with summer green, the orchards were heavy with fruit, and the long, golden afternoons stretched on as though the world beyond the English Channel were someone else's problem entirely. Farmers tended their crops. The war, for all its dread, still felt like something happening far away, but that illusion was about to be shattered. On the morning of Thursday, August the 8th, a decisive new phase began in what history would come to call the Battle of Britain. During the previous weeks, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been concentrating its efforts on British shipping in the English Channel, launching sorties against the south and east coasts. These had been probing attacks, testing Britain's defenses, measuring the response. But from the 8th of August, those attacks took on a terrifying new intensity. During the previous night, a convoy of slow-moving merchant ships, escorted by Royal Navy destroyers, had started its passage through the Channel. They were carrying food and munitions, the lifeblood of a nation under siege. But the convoy had been detected by the Germans, and early the next morning, waves of Stuka dive bombers, escorted by fighters, swooped down on the ships. The screaming of the Stukas' sirens, those mechanical banshee wails designed to terrorize anyone below, filled the air as bombs tore into the water and the hulls of the merchant vessels. 7 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled to meet them. In the fierce dogfights that followed, 31 German planes were brought down, for the loss of 19 of our own. 7 ships were sunk, and many more damaged. It was a brutal exchange, and it was to become the pattern of attack in the Channel during the following days, wave after wave of German aircraft, met by the desperate courage of a handful of British fighter pilots. But to understand how Britain found itself in this position alone, outnumbered, with its back against the sea, we need to go back a few months. Back to the decisions, the miscalculations, and the hubris that set the stage for what was about to unfold. Meantime, in Berlin, plans for the invasion of Britain were being pursued with cold, methodical precision. Hitler had hoped that with the fall of France, an isolated Britain might be glad to make a peace pact with him. France had capitulated in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven from the continent at Dunkirk. Surely, Hitler reasoned, the British would see the futility of continuing alone. He was wrong. When Churchill bluntly declined the offer, Hitler decided to invade at the earliest opportunity. And so the machinery of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's strategy for the invasion and occupation of Britain, was set into motion. The plan was methodical and terrifying in its ambition. Phase 1 was to knock out the Royal Air Force. With the RAF destroyed, Germany would have complete control of the air and sea lanes across the Channel. Phase 2 would begin with the destruction of Britain's coastline defenses. The Luftwaffe would then drop massive detachments of parachute troops to seize airfields and establish beachheads. And Phase 3, the actual invasion, would see panzer divisions crossing in high-speed barges under a protective umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters. Spearheads of landed troops would thrust into England to divide, surround, and destroy all opposition. On paper, it looked unstoppable, and in truth, there seemed to be very little opposition in the whole of Britain to stop it. The numbers were stark and sobering. There was not enough equipment left in the entire country for a single modern division. Just 1 tank for every 1,000 square miles of territory. Just 1 machine gun for each mile of beach. The British Navy, formidable as it was scattered all over the globe, guarding vital food and supply routes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in any case, it would have been suicide to use the fleet in the narrow waters of the Channel, with German aircraft flying overhead, dropping bombs and torpedoes on anything that moved. And then there was the Royal Air Force, Britain's last line of defense. But it was outnumbered by the enemy 10-1, both in trained men and machines, 10-1. Those were the odds facing every young pilot who climbed into a Spitfire or a Hurricane in the summer of 1940. There were the British people themselves. How would they react in the event of invasion? From the fall of France onwards, they had no doubt that there would be an attempt at invasion, and that it might come at any moment. They knew that every man, woman, and child in the country would be a target, so they knew they had a big job to do. For the civilian population, home front defense was the name of the game, to be ready for the onslaught whenever Hitler decided to unleash it. And back in Berlin, that was exactly what Hitler and his generals were discussing. The final touches were being put to the plans of Operation Sea Lion. The time had come for Phase 1 to begin. The mathematics of invasion seemed overwhelmingly in Germany's favor. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, overrun Denmark and Norway, swept through the Low Countries, and brought France, mighty France, with the largest army in Europe to its knees in just 6 weeks. Every army that had stood in Hitler's path had been crushed. Every fortress had fallen. Every defense line had been breached. Now, only 21 miles of gray, churning water stood between the most powerful military machine in history and the last free nation in Western Europe. For the men of Fighter Command, the stakes could not have been higher. They were not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were fighting for survival, the survival of their country, their families, and everything they held dear. If they failed, there would be no second chance. There would be no strategic withdrawal to fight another day. There would be only conquest, occupation, and the swastika flying over Buckingham Palace. That was the reality they faced every morning when they climbed into their cockpits, and that was the reality that drove them to fight with a ferocity and determination that Göring's pilots had never encountered before. Göring sent in hundreds of aircraft of all types, bombers, fighters, dive bombers across that 21-mile stretch of channel, a mere 8 short minutes of flying time. That was all that separated the airfields of northern France from the shores of southern England. 8 minutes between safety and annihilation. The first tactics were to bomb the convoys carrying food and munitions from overseas, bound for the ports of Bristol, Southampton, and London. German planes had already been carrying out scattered raids during July, but this was the first full concentrated attack, August the 8th. The next phase of the Battle of Britain had begun in earnest. Göring had promised the Luftwaffe that it would face little opposition from the RAF and would be able to knock it quickly out of the sky. He told his pilots they would have air superiority within days, perhaps weeks at most. However, there was a problem that Göring, in his arrogance, had failed to recognize. The Royal Air Force of August 1940 was quite a different creature from the poorly equipped outfit, which Hitler had known it to be at the time of Munich, 2 years before. In those 2 years, Britain had been quietly, desperately building. New factories had been erected, new aircraft had been designed and produced, and a generation of young men had been trained to fly them. The days of August 1940 were absolutely critical for both Britain and Germany, if not, in fact, for the future of the free world. The skies over southern England were a daily battleground of fighter aircraft. It was a time of war, perhaps the last, when battles were being waged on almost a personal basis by scarcely a handful of men, rather than by armies of nameless troops. They could see the whites of each other's eyes. They could watch a man they had just shot spinning down in flames, and they climbed back into their cockpits and did it again and again and again. These young men, many of them barely out of their teens, kept the vastly superior Nazi forces at bay. They gave Britain the breathing space it so desperately needed to bring its defenses up to scratch. Meantime, the German bombers continued pounding the coast from the Thames through Kent and Sussex to Weymouth and beyond. The battles themselves were terrifyingly brief and impossibly violent. A dogfight that felt like an eternity to the pilots involved might last only minutes. They fought at speeds of over 300 miles per hour, pulling turns so tight that the blood drained from their heads and their vision narrowed to a gray tunnel. They fired their guns in short, savage bursts, knowing they had only 15 seconds of ammunition. A single well-aimed burst could send an opponent spiraling to earth in flames. A single moment of inattention could mean death. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation, and precious little time for fear. And when they landed, if they landed, they taxied to their dispersal points, climbed out of their cockpits on legs that trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline, drank a mug of tea, and waited for the bell that would send them up again. Some of them flew so many sorties in a single day that they lost count. Some of them were so tired they could not remember the details of the fights they had just survived. In just the first 10 days of this phase of the Battle of Britain, the Germans launched no fewer than 26 major attacks. During that time, their aircraft losses totaled 4 times as many as ours. It was a ratio that defied every calculation the German High Command had made. For every British plane lost, 4 German aircraft were destroyed. And there was another factor working in Britain's favor. As many as 60 of the British pilots who bailed out over English soil were successfully rescued by the Air Sea Rescue Service. Most of the men picked up were trained and experienced pilots, fortunately able to fight again, unlike the German pilots Britain rescued, who became prisoners of war. Every German pilot shot down over England was a permanent loss. Every British pilot who survived was back in the cockpit the next day. The Germans now turned their attention increasingly to port towns such as Southampton, Plymouth, and others, trying to immobilize the ports before the supplies from overseas could grow from a trickle to a flood. The docks were bombed relentlessly. Warehouses were set ablaze. Cranes were twisted into useless wreckage. Though the ports took a terrible onslaught, they couldn't be knocked out entirely, and vital cargoes continued to be unloaded with the protection of the RAF above. It seemed that attacking the Hurricanes and Spitfires in the air just wasn't working. So Goering decided to try a different approach. If he couldn't shoot them down in the sky, he would smash them on the ground. The Luftwaffe turned its attention to the airfields Hawking, Manston, Tangmere, Biggin Hill, names that were to become household words to the citizens of Britain. Many planes were saved by quick thinking, parked in airfield corners close to trees and hedges, instead of being left out on the runways like sitting targets while awaiting the next sortie. The cost to the German attackers was high, and many trained pilots finished up as prisoners of war. But the airfields were being hit hard. Runways were cratered. Hangars were reduced to twisted metal. Communications were severed. It was a frustrating time for the Nazi leaders. On a 2,000-mile front from Norway to Normandy, their Blitz program was being stymied because the RAF was still flying. Against all odds, against all predictions, against every rational calculation, the RAF was still in the air. Hitler sent for Field Marshal Goering and ordered him to bring British resistance to a quick end. It was seriously holding up his plans for invasion before mid-September and the end of summer. The urgency was real. Hitler knew that a channel crossing would only be feasible in the calm waters of late summer. Once autumn arrived, the seas would become too rough for the flat-bottomed barges he planned to use. Every day the RAF survived was a day closer to the weather turning against him. Every week of delay narrowed the window until it would slam shut entirely. The clock was ticking, and for once, it was not ticking in Germany's favor. The losses, meanwhile, were mounting on both sides. Every morning, the tally boards at Fighter Command headquarters were updated: aircraft lost, pilots killed, pilots wounded, pilots missing. The numbers were grim, but they were grimmer still for the Luftwaffe. Goering's Air Force was bleeding pilots and aircraft at a rate it could not sustain indefinitely. The Channel, which was supposed to be merely a minor obstacle, had become a graveyard for German airmen. Those who bailed out over England were captured. Those who came down in the Channel often drowned before rescue could reach them. The attrition was relentless. Goering ordered all-out attacks not only on the airfields further inland, but on factories, machine shops, and anything supplying the aircraft industry. If he couldn't knock out the RAF in the air, he hoped to knock it out by starvation on the assembly line. No more Spitfires, no more Hurricanes, no more replacement engines, no more spare parts. Starve the beast, and eventually it would die. He adopted the tactic of using proportionally more fighters per bomber, so that the bombers were well protected for doing their destructive job. Escorted by their fighters all around them, above, below, on every flank, the German formations were able to break through the coastal defenses by sheer weight of numbers. They reached further inland than they had so far managed, bombing aerodromes, aircraft plants, munitions, factories, and machine shops. The damage was severe. Hangars burned. Factories were reduced to rubble. Workshops that had been producing vital components for Spitfires and Hurricanes were flattened overnight. For a few desperate weeks, it seemed as though Goering's new strategy might actually succeed. But the people's morale was at a remarkable level. Factories that were bombed on Monday were producing again by Wednesday. Workers cleared the rubble, rigged temporary shelters, and went back to their lathes and their assembly lines. The defense system was improving rapidly too. Observation and listening posts were set up all along the coast, in addition to radar, that revolutionary new technology that could detect enemy aircraft before they even left the continent. The system worked with extraordinary efficiency. A quick flash from a control station to the nearest fighter station, and British pilots were on their way to greet the enemy before he reached the shores of Britain while still over the Channel. This ability to detect and intercept was something Goering had never anticipated, and it was costing him dearly. Day after day, aerial battles were fought out in the skies, 4 or 5 miles above the countryside of Kent and Sussex. Sometimes they were out of sight, and often out of sound of the spotters below. The pilots kept flying, barely snatching a couple of hours' rest before scrambling to another sortie. This sometimes continued for days on end. They flew until they could barely keep their eyes open, landed, drank a cup of tea, and flew again. The exhaustion was crushing, the losses were mounting, but they kept going. As far as the Nazi leaders were concerned, their plans for invasion were going nowhere fast. Already, Hitler had been forced to postpone the proposed date of Operation Sea Lion. The RAF simply would not die. And with every passing day, every failed raid, every bomber that didn't return to its French airfield, the window of opportunity for a channel crossing was growing narrower. The airfields of southern England had become the most contested ground on Earth. Biggin Hill alone was bombed repeatedly. On some days, the damage was so severe that operations had to be moved to emergency satellite fields. Craters scarred the runways, but the ground crews filled the holes, the engineers rigged new telephone lines, and the fighters kept taking off. The resilience was extraordinary. It was as if the very earth of England was refusing to yield. The pilots themselves were being pushed to the very limit of human endurance. Many of them were flying 5, 6, even 7 sorties a day. They grabbed sleep where they could in deck chairs beside the runway, in the cockpits of their aircraft, in any corner where they could close their eyes for 20 minutes before the bell rang again, and they were sprinting for their planes, and the losses among them were devastating. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot during those weeks was measured not in months but in days. New pilots arrived from training schools, flew their first sortie, and were dead by tea time. The experienced pilots carried a burden that few could imagine: the knowledge that every friend they made might be gone tomorrow, and the certainty that their own turn could come at any moment. Yet they kept flying, they kept fighting, and slowly, imperceptibly, they were winning. The time had come to employ a different tactic entirely. From now on, the objective was plain and simple. It was to crush and devastate the spirit and morale of the British people, to make it impossible for them to continue the war against the Nazis any longer. If the RAF could not be destroyed in the air or on the ground, then perhaps the will of the people who supported it could be broken instead. It began on the afternoon of Saturday, September the 7th, 1940. 300 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, darkened the sky over the Thames estuary. It was a formation so vast that it took 20 minutes to pass overhead. The target was not the airfields, not the radar stations, not the ports. The target was London itself. The switch from military targets to the capital city was, though no one knew it at the time, a strategic blunder of the highest order. It gave the battered airfields of Fighter Command a desperately needed respite. It gave the ground crews time to repair the runways and the communications links, and it gave the pilots a few precious hours of rest. But for the people of London, it marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test them to the very core of their being. For the Luftwaffe, there was no pretense of striking only military targets. The docks were hit, the factories were hit, but so were the homes, the schools, the hospitals, the churches. Entire streets were reduced to mountains of brick and broken timber. Families emerged from their shelters at dawn to find their homes gone, their neighborhoods unrecognizable, their neighbors dead or missing. Throughout the following week, Göring sent fleets of bombers to smash the spirit of the citizens, but without success. The spirit would not break. So Göring decided to throw in the full might of his Luftwaffe in one of the greatest air attacks ever mounted until that point in the war. It was a Sunday. The date, September the 15th, 1940, a day that would become one of the most famous dates in the Battle of Britain. It was an ideal summer day, clear skies, warm sunshine, when a fleet of 500 German bombers and fighters flew over the Channel and crossed the English coast, approaching from the southwest. Londoners taking a Sunday stroll in the parks, families sitting down to their roast dinners, children kicking footballs in the streets. They were largely unaware that an historic, three-dimensional battle was being fought to the death in the skies above them. It was aerial warfare on a scale never before seen. In the first half hour alone, 200 individual combats had taken place, 200 separate duels between pilots who could see each other through their canopies, who fired at each other from distances measured in yards, who watched each other fall. Some German planes pierced the London defenses. Some reached the sky above the city center itself. Bombs fell, buildings burned, people died. But the RAF was everywhere, and the toll on the German formations was devastating. What made this day different from all the others was not simply the scale of the attack, but the totality of the British response. Every available squadron was thrown into the fight. There were no reserves. Fighter Command had committed everything it had. If the Germans had known that, if they had known that one more wave of bombers might have found empty skies above London, the outcome might have been very different. But they did not know. All they knew was that everywhere they turned, there were Spitfires and Hurricanes diving out of the sun, raking their formations with machine gun fire, breaking up their bomber streams, sending aircraft tumbling earthward in spirals of smoke and flame. For the German pilots who survived that day and limped back to their airfields in northern France, the message was unmistakable. The RAF was not destroyed. It was not even close to being destroyed. The promises Goering had made, that British air power would be swept from the skies in a matter of days, had been exposed as fantasy. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best punch, and Britain had absorbed it and punched back harder. It wasn't until most people had returned home that evening and listened to their wireless sets that they learned about the most decisive air battle of the war. The first reports gave an overestimate of the German aircraft shot down the fog of war, inflated the numbers. It wasn't until much later that the figures were revised downward. Nevertheless, the reality was clear. It had been a mortal blow to the Luftwaffe and to Hitler's plans for invading Britain. On the 17th of September, just 2 days later, the invasion was postponed indefinitely. Operation Sea Lion, that grand plan to send panzer divisions across the Channel, to drop paratroops on English soil, to march through London in triumph, it was over, not cancelled, officially, just postponed. But everyone knew. September the 15th, 1940, the day the invasion died. But the end of the invasion threat did not mean the end of the bombing. Far from it. The Nazi military policy now shifted entirely to the destruction of the capital, mostly at night. The RAF couldn't be much help after dark. The technology for effective night fighting was still in its infancy. And so, when the sun went down, the defense of London rested on the efficiency of searchlights and the accuracy of anti-aircraft fire. The German bombers concentrated particularly on London's dockland and left the East End districts a roaring inferno. The docks were a legitimate military target. Of course, the point through which much of Britain's imported food and war materials flowed. But the bombs didn't discriminate between a warehouse full of grain and a terraced house full of families. The fires spread. The devastation was indiscriminate. Night after night, the bombers came. The people of London learned to sleep underground, in the tube stations, on the platforms, wrapped in blankets, their children pressed close. They learned the sounds, the distant drone that grew louder, the crump of explosions walking closer. British bombers were taking the Blitz back into its country of origin. The RAF was striking at German cities, at factories, at military targets. It was a small force, nothing compared to what Bomber Command would eventually become. But it was a statement of defiance. Britain was not merely enduring, Britain was hitting back. The ambulance drivers who raced through streets filled with rubble and unexploded ordnance to reach the wounded. The underground stations of London became a world of their own during those long nights. Entire communities formed on the platforms. People claimed their regular spots. Children did their homework by candlelight. Elderly couples shared blankets and flasks of tea. But above all, there was a grim, shared determination to see it through. The station smelled of sweat and dust and damp wool, and the rumble of the trains had been replaced by the rumble of bombs. But they were safe down there. Hitler was furious. He proclaimed the RAF night gangsters, and for their crime, he vowed to exact on British cities a thousandfold revenge. The first target of this vengeful fury was to be the city of Coventry. On the night of the 14th of November, 1940, 1 million pounds of bombs were hurled on the city between dusk and the following dawn. Coventry was bombed flatter and more heavily than Rotterdam or Warsaw. The medieval cathedral, which had stood for 500 years, was reduced to a shell. Streets that had been full of life that morning were unrecognizable by daybreak. The destruction was almost total, and yet, the almost total destruction of Coventry and of other cities such as Plymouth brought the war not a single second nearer to its end for the Germans. Night after night, week after week, the bombers returned. The people of London developed routines of survival. They learned to read the sounds of the raid, the distant drone that meant the bombers were still far away, the rising pitch that meant they were closing in, the sudden silence that meant a bomb was falling directly overhead. They learned which shelters were strongest, which tube stations were deepest, which basements offered the best protection. They learned to sleep through everything except a direct hit. They adapted, because adaptation was the price of survival. Each of those nights brought its own particular horror. Some nights, the East End bore the brunt, the narrow streets of Stepney and Poplar consumed by fire. Other nights, the bombers ranged further west, hitting Mayfair and Westminster. The Houses of Parliament were hit. Buckingham Palace was hit. The King and Queen remained in London throughout, sharing the danger with their people, and the fact that even the palace had been bombed created a strange solidarity in the rubble. The night shifts in the factories continued through the raids. Workers crouched under their benches when the bombs fell close, then stood and went back to their lathes. Production never stopped. Every Spitfire that rolled off the line was a small victory against the German strategy of terror. For 109 consecutive nights, one part of London or another was savagely bombed. 109 nights of sirens, of sheltering, of waiting, of emerging into the smoke and dust to count the dead and begin again. But unexpectedly, one night, the citizens had their first night off, December the 25th, 1940, Christmas Day. It was an unbelievable break. Families gathered together. Children opened what few presents could be found. For one night, just one, the skies were silent. No sirens, no bombs, no fires. Just the quiet of a winter's night and the fragile illusion of peace, but it was only a break. Boxing Day came, and with it, the bombers returned. And yet, in the days and weeks that followed, something began to change. The citizens became aware that the raids were becoming shorter and fewer. By the spring, they were hardly there at all. The dark skies of winter were giving way to quieter nights. People began to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was over. And then, almost out of the blue, the Blitz returned with doubled fury. For many people, it seemed worse than anything that had gone before. Millions of incendiary bombs rained down on the capital, small, deadly devices designed not to explode but to burn, and burn they did. In a matter of minutes, more than 1,500 different sections of the city burst into roaring flames. Flames that merged together, flames that fed on each other, flames that created their own wind, sucking in air from the surrounding streets, and sending columns of fire hundreds of feet into the sky. It was the greatest fire London had seen since the Great Fire of 1666, almost 300 years before. The comparison was not lost on anyone. Below ground, in the tube stations and the shelters, the people of London felt they were back where they had been 4 months ago. The hope that had been building through the quieter weeks of spring evaporated in a single night of fire. It seemed that they were going to have to endure it all over again. The weariness was crushing. The fear was real, but the resolve remained. And then, the next day, to everyone's amazement, there was no siren, no drone of bombers, no crump of explosions, no fires on the horizon, just silence. The people waited. They braced themselves. Surely it was coming. Surely this was just another brief respite before the next wave. But the wave never came. They didn't know it then, couldn't have known it then, but Hitler had turned away from Britain to undertake the conquest of Russia. The Luftwaffe was being redeployed eastward to the vast steppes and frozen plains of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of Russia, had become his new obsession, and in pursuing it, he had made what history would judge to be his most catastrophic mistake. The silence that followed the last bombs was, for many Londoners, the strangest sound they had ever heard. For months, the soundtrack of their lives had been sirens, explosions, the crackling of fires, and the rumble of collapsing buildings. Now there was only quiet. People stepped outside and looked up at skies that were, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, empty of threat. They looked at their battered city, at the gaps in the skyline where familiar buildings had stood, at the weeds already growing in the bomb craters, and they understood, slowly, that something had changed. Hitler had gambled that if he made the British people suffer enough, they would demand peace. He had lost that gamble, just as he had lost the air battle over the Channel, just as he had lost the battle for the airfields, just as he was about to lose the war itself. The Battle of Britain was over. It had been finally won, but not by Hitler. The cost of what had just occurred was staggering. In the skies over southern England, in the burning streets of London and Coventry and Plymouth, a nation had been tested to its very limits and had refused to yield. Hitler had lost 2,375 aircraft and their crews. For the first time in the war, the Germans had tasted defeat. For almost a year, they had struck Britain with their formidable might, the most powerful air force the world had ever seen, backed by the resources of an entire conquered continent. They had thrown everything they had at this stubborn little island. They had killed over 40,000 British people. they had seriously wounded 50,000 more. They had reduced entire cities to rubble. They had left hundreds of thousands homeless. They had bombed cathedrals and hospitals and schools and homes. The physical scars of the Blitz would take years to heal. Entire districts of London remained wastelands of rubble and wild flowers for a decade after the war ended. The gaps in the skyline where churches and office buildings had once stood served as daily reminders of what had been endured. The psychological scars lasted even longer. And yet, when the accounting was done, when the dust had settled and the fires had died and the last all clear had sounded, one immutable fact stood above all others. But from the start, from the very first bomb to the very last, not one single Nazi soldier set foot as an invader upon the soil of mainland Britain. Not one. The beaches that Hitler had planned to storm remained unviolated. The airfields where his paratroopers were supposed to land remained in British hands. The roads along which his panzer divisions were meant to roll remained the province of farmers and families and Home Guard volunteers with pitchforks and ancient rifles. Operation Sea Lion, that grand, terrifying plan to invade and occupy Britain, was never carried out. It remains one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the RAF had been just a little weaker? What if the radar system had failed? What if the people's morale had cracked? What if Göring had continued attacking the airfields instead of switching to the cities? The margins were thin, the outcome was never certain, and the consequences of failure would have been unthinkable. But the significance of the Battle of Britain extends far beyond the survival of one nation. The Battle of Britain and the people who won it also won for the world a year of precious time in which to prepare for final victory. Think about what that year meant. In the 12 months that followed the Battle of Britain, the United States moved ever closer to entering the war. The industrial might of America began to be mobilized. The Soviet Union was drawn into the conflict, opening a second front that would ultimately consume the German army. The pieces that would eventually lead to D-Day, to the liberation of Europe, to the defeat of Nazi Germany, they all required time to fall into place. Consider what the world looked like in the autumn of 1940. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Norway and Denmark were under Nazi control. Poland had been dismembered. Austria had been absorbed. Czechoslovakia had been swallowed whole. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, the swastika flew over a conquered continent. Britain stood alone, the last flickering light of democracy in a continent engulfed by tyranny. If that light had been extinguished, who would have rekindled it? Where would the forces of liberation have gathered? Where would the American troops have massed for D-Day? Where would the bombers have launched from to strike at the heart of the Reich? The answers are nowhere and no one. Britain's survival in 1940 was not merely a national achievement, it was a turning point for civilization itself. The cost was enormous. Entire neighborhoods were erased from the map. Families were torn apart. Children grew up in shelters, knowing the sound of falling bombs before they knew the sound of birdsong. A generation of young men was consumed in the cockpits of their fighters, their average age barely 21, their bravery beyond measure, their sacrifice beyond price. In the decades since the war, the memory of the Battle of Britain has taken on an almost mythic quality. The story of the few, those young fighter pilots who scrambled into their cockpits day after day, has become one of the defining narratives of the 20th century. But it would be a disservice to history to remember only the pilots. The Battle of Britain was won by the pilots, yes, but it was also won by the ground crews who repaired damaged aircraft through the night, working by torchlight in bombed-out hangars. It was won by the factory workers who built Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the Germans could destroy them. It was won by the radar operators who stared at their screens hour after hour, watching for the green blips that meant another raid was incoming. It was won by the Observer Corps volunteers who stood on cliff tops and church towers, scanning the skies with binoculars. It was won by the anti-aircraft gunners who fired into the darkness. And it was won by the ordinary men, women, and children of London, Coventry, Plymouth, Southampton, and 100 other towns and cities who endured the Blitz with a resilience that still defies explanation, who sheltered in tube stations and emerged into the rubble, who dug their neighbors out with their bare hands. Over 40,000 of them paid with their lives. They were not soldiers. They were not trained for combat. They were shopkeepers and teachers and dockhands and housewives and pensioners and children. And they bore the brunt of Hitler's fury, night after night, for months on end. The Home Guard volunteers, armed with little more than determination and whatever weapons they could find, drilled in the fields, and manned the observation posts. The land girls took over the farms, feeding a nation under siege. The factory workers, many of them women who had never worked outside the home before, turned out Spitfires and Hurricanes and ammunition at a pace that astounded even the most optimistic planners. The merchant seamen, often overlooked in the telling of this story, continued to sail their convoys through waters infested with U-boats and harried by Luftwaffe bombers, bringing the food and fuel and raw materials without which Britain would have starved. All of them were part of the Battle of Britain. All of them deserved to stand alongside the fighter pilots in the halls of memory. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, not as footnotes in a military history, but as people. People who were afraid and who endured anyway. People who lost everything and who rebuilt. People who, in the darkest hour of their nation's history, found within themselves a strength they never knew they had. The Battle of Britain lasted from the summer of 1940 to the spring of 1941. In the grand sweep of the Second World War, it was a single chapter in a conflict that would rage for 6 years across every continent, but it was the chapter that mattered most. Because if Britain had fallen, if the RAF had been destroyed, if the people had surrendered, if Hitler had crossed the Channel, there would have been no base from which to launch the liberation of Europe, no staging ground for D-Day, no unsinkable aircraft carrier from which American and British forces could strike back at the heart of Nazi Germany. Everything that followed, every victory, every liberation, every step on the long road to Berlin was built on the foundation of what happened in the skies over southern England in the summer and autumn of 1940. The Germans lost 2,375 planes and crew. They killed over 40,000 British people and seriously wounded 50,000 more. But they did not break Britain. They did not invade. They did not conquer. And in failing to do so, they lost something far more important than aircraft and pilots. They lost the aura of invincibility that had carried them across Europe. They proved, for the first time, that the Nazi war machine could be stopped, and the world took notice. Years later, looking back on those desperate months, Churchill would offer his immortal tribute to the fighter pilots who had held the line. But the tribute belongs to all of them, the pilots and the ground crews, the factory workers and the fire wardens, the mothers in the shelters and the children in the evacuee trains. They were all part of it. They all played their part. The Battle of Britain was not won by generals or politicians or grand strategy. It was won by ordinary people who, when the moment of greatest danger arrived, proved to be anything but ordinary. It was won by a nation that looked into the abyss and chose, with quiet, stubborn defiance, not to fall. In every cemetery where the fallen of the Battle of Britain rest, in every memorial where their names are carved in stone, the same truth echoes across the decades. These were people who stood when it would have been easier to kneel, who fought when every calculation said they should lose, who endured when the rest of the world expected them to break. They did not fight for glory or for conquest. They fought for their homes, their families, their way of life. And in doing so, they changed the course of history, not just for Britain, for the world. That is the legacy of the Battle of Britain. That is what those months of fire and courage and sacrifice truly mean. And that is why, more than 80 years later, we remember, because the story of what happened in the skies over southern England in the summer and autumn of 1940 is not merely a story about war. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when everything they love hangs in the balance. It is a story about the triumph of courage over fear, of resilience over despair, of hope over darkness. And it is a story that must never be forgotten. In September of 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Bomber Command possessed just 53 squadrons. Of these, only 33 were considered fully operational, and 10 of those were immediately dispatched to France to accompany the British Expeditionary Force, leaving barely 24 squadrons to defend and strike from the British Isles. The aircraft these squadrons flew were a generation behind what modern warfare demanded. Blenheims, Hamptons, Wellingtons, Whitleys, and ferry battles, all of them at least 6 years old in concept, designed in an era when the theory of strategic bombing was still largely untested. When air war was still the stuff of speculation and peacetime exercises, they were slow, they were underarmed, their bomb loads were modest, and their range was limited. With little more than 300 first-line bombers based in Britain, Bomber Command was clearly incapable of pursuing any true bombing offensive against Germany. But there was a deeper problem than numbers and machines. There was a theory, a belief that had been enshrined in RAF doctrine throughout the 1930s, that the bomber would always get through, that tightly formed groups of bombers, flying in daylight, could defend themselves against fighter attack with their own defensive armament, that they could find their targets, bomb them accurately, and return home without the need for fighter escort. It was a theory born of peacetime optimism, and it was about to be destroyed by the reality of war. Throughout the winter months of 1939 to 40, RAF bombers were dispatched in tiny formations on what were termed armed reconnaissance sorties. The young crews, maintaining the tight formations advocated by the bomber hierarchy, ventured over the North Sea and into German airspace with a confidence that was tragically misplaced. They were quickly disillusioned about their defensive capabilities. The disastrous results of these early raids revealed the inadequacy of the unescorted bomber theory with brutal clarity. German fighters, principally the Messerschmitt 109, tore into the slow-moving British formations with devastating efficiency. Bomber after bomber was shot from the sky. The losses were not just heavy, they were unsustainable. On some raids, a third or more of the attacking force failed to return. The young crews, many of them barely out of training, learned the hardest possible lesson, that the theories they had been taught were wrong, and that the price of being wrong in war was death. The disastrous results forced the RAF to restrict its bombing to night raids in future. Under cover of darkness, the bombers had a better chance of surviving, but darkness brought its own problems. Finding a target in daylight was difficult enough. Finding one at night, over blacked-out enemy territory, with only a compass and the stars for guidance, was a challenge that would take years and thousands of lives to master. And yet, even in those dark early months, Bomber Command was laying the foundations for what would eventually become the most sustained and devastating aerial campaign in history. Lessons were being learned. New tactics were being developed, and somewhere in the factories of Britain, the aircraft that would transform the bombing war were already taking shape on the drawing boards and the assembly lines. The question was whether Bomber Command could survive long enough to use them. The crews who flew those early missions carried a burden that went beyond the physical dangers of combat. They were pioneers in a form of warfare that had never been attempted on this scale. Everything was new. Everything was uncertain. The navigation techniques they used were primitive dead reckoning, compass bearings, and whatever landmarks they could identify through gaps in the cloud. On a clear night, with a full moon, they might be able to follow a river or a coastline to their target. On a cloudy night, they were essentially flying blind, trusting their calculations and hoping they were somewhere close to where they needed to be. The cold was another enemy. At altitude, and the constant vibration of the engines, hour after hour, drained the energy and concentration of even the most experienced crews. And always, there was the knowledge that they might not come back. Every briefing room, every dispersal hut, every crew room on every bomber station had its empty chairs, the places where friends had sat yesterday, friends who had not returned, friends whose names would be spoken quietly and then, gradually, not spoken at all. The turnover was relentless. New faces appeared, old faces vanished, and the war went on. On the 16th and 17th of December, 1940, in what was possibly their last significant raid of that year, RAF Bomber Command marked a new and controversial departure in the air war. The aiming point for the 134 aircraft dispatched that night was not any industrial area or individual building. It was the very center of the town of Mannheim. This was a reprisal raid carried out in direct retaliation for the bombing of Coventry and other British towns, and it represented a fundamental shift in policy. Until now, Bomber Command had officially been targeting military and industrial objectives. Mannheim was different. This was the first purely urban attack, the largest number of British bombers sent to date against a single target, with the explicit aim of hitting the town itself. The first 14 Wellingtons were sent in carrying incendiary bombs, their mission to set the town alight and mark the target with fire. The rest of the bomber force followed the glare of the flames, dropping their high explosives into the glow below. At a cost of only 3 aircraft lost and 4 more that crashed on return, the force destroyed 476 buildings, killed 47 people, and made a further 12,000 166 homeless. The tactic of using fire as a marker had proven its worth. It would become a cornerstone of Bomber Command's strategy. 1941 opened for Bomber Command with a raid on the very first day of the year. More than 100 aircraft took off to bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and other industrial targets in the city of Bremen. The raid was a success, and the losses to the RAF were slight. In fact, the year began with a new directive, which was a continuation of the one issued at the end of 1940. Oil was the primary target. Germany's war machine ran on oil, its tanks, its aircraft, its U-boats, its transport. Destroy the oil, and the machine would grind to a halt. The logic was impeccable. The execution, however, was another matter entirely. The poor weather conditions of that winter were still hampering operations. Clouds obscured the targets. Navigation was unreliable. Bombs fell on open fields, on forests, on anything except the factories they were aimed at. In March, another diversion arose, pulling bombing away from those primary oil targets for the following 4 months. The priority now was to defeat Germany's attempt to cut off Britain's food supplies and her connection with the United States. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a critical phase, and the U-boats were sinking merchant shipping at an alarming rate. The Admiralty, absorbed almost entirely in its campaign against the German submarines threatening Britain's lifelines, pleaded strongly for bomber squadrons to be employed against the U-boat bases and especially the German capital ships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen, which were based at Brest. By mid-March of 1941, 17 new squadrons had been added to the force, and even more importantly, the first of the new type of heavy bombers were trickling into service. These were the aircraft that the designers had been working on since before the war. Bigger, faster, capable of carrying heavier bomb loads over greater distances. They were still arriving in small numbers, but they represented the future. The high-capacity bomb, known as the HC, made its debut when, on March the 31st, 2 4,000-pound HC bombs were dropped on Emden by specially modified Wellingtons. These enormous weapons, each weighing nearly 2 tons, were a quantum leap from the modest bombs of the early war. They were complemented by an increasing variety of incendiary bombs, often fitted with explosive charges that would scatter burning material over a wide area. But the raid on Bremen, on the 27th to 28th of June, revealed a disturbing new development in the enemy's defenses. German night fighters were now operating in large numbers. The result was the highest number of bombers lost in a night raid so far, 14 aircraft out of a force of 108. The night sky over Germany, which had offered relative safety compared to the lethal daylight, was becoming a killing ground of its own. By July, the air staff was free to return to a strategic bombing campaign. It was clear that the earlier campaign against oil installations had caused little damage and no major effect on production. In a directive issued on the 9th of July, 1941, Bomber Command was ordered to dislocate the German transportation system, isolating industrial regions and preventing the movement of war materials to the front. In November, 105 Squadron received its first example of a revolutionary new aircraft, the de Havilland Mosquito, an all-wood bomber of extraordinary speed and versatility. It was the harbinger of a host of Mosquito variants that were to become a major factor in the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. Fast enough to outrun most fighters, agile enough to fly at low level or at great altitude, the Mosquito would prove to be one of the most adaptable and effective aircraft of the entire war. A momentous turning point for Bomber Command came on February the 20th, 1942, when a new commander took up his appointment. His name was Air Marshal Arthur Harris. He was blunt, stubborn, single-minded, and utterly convinced that strategic bombing could win the war. He would become the most controversial figure in the history of the air war, admired by his crews, respected by his enemies, and debated by historians for generations. But there was no question about one thing. Arthur Harris transformed Bomber Command from a blunt instrument into a weapon of devastating precision and power. Just 6 days before Harris took command, a directive emanating from the Air Staff and sanctioned by the War Cabinet had ordered Bomber Command to commence a prolonged aerial bombing campaign whereby large targets such as industrial towns and cities were to become primary targets. For night bombing, the debate about whether to bomb specific military targets or entire industrial areas had been settled by necessity as much as by strategy. Bomber Command simply could not hit individual factories at night with any consistency, but it could hit cities, and so cities became the targets. Harris wasted no time. On the 8th and 9th of March, and for the following 2 nights, bombers led by the new G navigational system hit the town of Essen. G proved itself as an excellent navigational aid, but the crews found it was not precise enough for the blind bombing of specific targets. On the 13th and 14th of March, after a raid on Kiel, Harris turned to another of his 4 major targets, the city of Cologne. Cologne was hit by 135 aircraft, which managed to start 237 fires, destroy several factories, and damage over 1,500 houses. But Essen remained the #1 target home to the vast Krupp armaments works, the industrial heart of the German war machine. Over the next 2 weeks, Harris made 5 more attempts to hit it. Each time, the industrial haze that hung over the Ruhr Valley, combined with the limitations of available navigation technology, made accurate bombing almost impossible. Harris was learning that determination alone was not enough. He needed better tools, better tactics, and above all, more aircraft. And then came the night that changed everything. On the night of the 30th and 31st of May, 1942, a total of 1,046 bombers took off in 2 waves from airfields throughout the east of England. Their destination was Cologne. They were preceded by 88 aircraft on intruder and diversionary sorties to confuse the German defenses. It was an audacious gamble. Harris had scraped together every aircraft he could find, not just frontline bombers, but training aircraft, reserve aircraft, anything that could carry a bomb and fly to Germany. He was staking everything on a single, massive blow. Never before had the German night fighters been offered such a golden opportunity. Over 1,000 bombers streaming across the North Sea in a concentrated river of aircraft, but no fighters came. Hitler, against the advice of his commanders, had made another of his costly mistakes. He had forbidden the Luftwaffe to attack the RAF over British soil. Had he not given this order, this raid could not only have been the first 1,000-bomber raid, but also the last and possibly the costliest raid ever for Bomber Command. The first of the bombers were spotted on German radar as they passed over the Dutch coast. There was surprisingly little resistance from the night fighters, although there was considerable flak. The bombers converged on the center of the city. They came in and bombed at a rate of 1 aircraft every 6 seconds. Incendiaries crashed downward, splashing brilliant white as they hit the ground. For the bombers still coming in, the red glare below was like daylight. The people of Cologne were now finding a bitter meaning in the words of propaganda minister Dr. Goebbels, "We are all in the front line now." The bomber stream turned for home, leaving behind a city that was burning from end to end. The fires were visible from the Dutch coast, a dull orange glow on the southern horizon that the returning crews could see for over 100 miles. Below them, Cologne was wrapped in a shroud of smoke and flame that rose thousands of feet into the night sky. 13,000 homes had been destroyed. 45,000 people were now homeless. 1,500 factories were obliterated beyond repair, and 630 more were seriously damaged. In a single night, Bomber Command had inflicted more damage on one city than it had achieved in the previous 2 years of bombing combined. Harris had proved his point. The era of the 1,000-bomber raid had begun. Harris had achieved his prime objectives and received approval for the future massive expansion of the force. This night marked a turning point for Bomber Command, the moment it transformed from a struggling, under-equipped force into a strategic weapon that could reshape the landscape of war. In August of 1942, a new formation of huge significance came into being when the Pathfinder Force was inaugurated. Its purpose was succinct and vital: to spearhead main bombing sorties and locate and mark the target accurately before the main bomber stream arrived. The Pathfinders were the elite of Bomber Command, the best navigators, the most experienced crews, flying the most capable aircraft. Their job was to find the target in the darkness, drop colored marker flares to illuminate it, and then guide the hundreds of following bombers onto the aiming point. It was a concept born of painful experience. Raid after raid had shown that the majority of bomber crews, flying in darkness over hostile territory, simply could not find their targets. Post-raid reconnaissance photographs had revealed the humiliating truth. Bombs were falling miles from their intended aiming points, sometimes in open countryside, sometimes on the wrong town entirely. A report commissioned in 1941, known as the Butt Report, had delivered the devastating conclusion that only 1 in 3 aircraft that claimed to have attacked their target had actually dropped bombs within 5 miles of it. In the vast industrial landscape of the Ruhr, that could mean the difference between hitting a factory and hitting a field. The Pathfinder Force was the answer to this damning revelation, a dedicated group of specialists whose sole purpose was to ensure that the main force's bombs fell where they were supposed to. As 1942 drew to a close, Harris now had a force that was considerably stronger than the one he had inherited 10 months earlier. The Cologne raid had proved that accuracy in hitting the target had increased by 30%. New aircraft, new navigation aids, new tactics, and the growing experience of the crews were all contributing to a force that was becoming more effective with every passing month. Lancasters, led by Pathfinders, found and attacked with some success Dusseldorf, Duisburg, and Essen, targets that had frustrated Bomber Command for years. A total of 43 major raids were mounted between March and June of 1943. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was being systematically pounded. The last blows of the Ruhr campaign came on the 25th and 26th of July, when Harris sent 705 aircraft to bomb Essen, and the final raid on the 30th and 31st of July, when a force of 273 aircraft hit the town of Remscheid, a Ruhr town not previously attacked. 4/5 of the built-up area was destroyed, and over 100 factories and commercial buildings were put out of action. And then, on the night of May the 16th and 17th, 1943, came one of the most audacious operations in the history of aerial warfare. 19 specially modified Lancasters of the recently formed 617 Squadron attacked the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams using precise low-level attack methods and specially constructed cylindrical explosive canisters designed by the inventor Barnes Wallis. The Dam Busters raid, as it became known, captured the public imagination like no other operation of the war, but the cost was high. 8 of the 19 Lancasters were lost, along with 53 of the finest aircrew in Bomber Command. It was a ratio of losses that would have been unsustainable in a prolonged campaign, but as a single spectacular blow against the German war machine, it was without equal. By the summer of 1943, Bomber Command had been joined in its offensives by the B-17S and B-24S of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. The Americans concentrated on daylight sorties, flying in tight box formations that bristled with defensive machine guns, believing, as the RAF had once believed, that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves in daylight. Initially, this approach forced them to suffer a high casualty rate. The German fighters, experienced and aggressive, exploited every weakness in the American formations. But these heavy daylight raids complemented Harris's nightly onslaught. Germany was now being bombed around the clock by the Americans during the day, and by the British at night. There was no respite. This combined bomber offensive was authorized by a fresh directive from the Combined Chiefs of Staff named Point Blank, dated June the 10th, 1943, expressing concern over the mounting casualties caused by the enlarging and increasingly efficient Luftwaffe fighter defenses. Point Blank called for a switch in concentration to targets directly related to those fighters and their supporting industry. But Harris had a different target in mind. As the second most important city of Germany, Hamburg offered great possibilities for area destruction. In 1943, Hamburg was the largest port in Europe and Germany's second largest city, with a population of around 1 million. It was a sprawling metropolis of docks and warehouses, factories and shipyards, residential districts and commercial centers, and it was about to experience something the world had never seen before. 80 miles from the German coast, the night fighters, guided to their targets by ground controllers who could no longer distinguish real bombers from strips of tinfoil, groped helplessly through the night. Window had paralyzed the German air defense system at a stroke. The effect was immediate and devastating. Bomber losses over Hamburg were dramatically lower than they would otherwise have been. All but 63 of the 791 aircraft dropped 2,277 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs into the built-up areas of the city and port. The destruction was immense, but it was only the beginning, for the fires that had started with the incendiary devices did not burn out. They grew, they fed on themselves. Hamburg experienced the world's first firestorm. The weather had been very hot and dry, which caused the timber-framed buildings to burn with ferocious ease. The individual fires from thousands of incendiary bombs spread and joined together, growing from scattered blazes into one colossal inferno. The rising heat was so intense that it created a violent updraft, a column of superheated air that rose thousands of feet into the sky. The temperatures at the heart of the firestorm reached 800 degrees. Asphalt roads melted and bubbled. Glass windows shattered from the heat alone. People in their shelters were suffocated as the fire consumed all the oxygen in the air above them. The inferno raged for hours, consuming entire districts, reducing blocks of apartments to ash, melting the steel frames of factories, turning the canals to steam. 2 further raids completed the fearful destruction of the ancient city. The Battle of Hamburg was one of the most concentrated and successful series of operations undertaken by Bomber Command. In terms of destruction, the results were unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. The scale of what happened at Hamburg sent shockwaves through the German leadership. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later stated that 6 more attacks on that scale against other major German cities would have brought the German war effort to a complete halt. The industrial output of Hamburg was devastated. Shipyards that had been producing U-boats were reduced to twisted metal. Refineries that had been processing oil were flattened. The city's population, traumatized beyond anything they had ever experienced, fled in their hundreds of thousands, streaming out along the roads in a mass exodus that overwhelmed the surrounding towns and villages. For the crews of Bomber Command, Hamburg was a vindication. It proved that strategic bombing could inflict damage on a scale that genuinely threatened Germany's ability to wage war. In the summer of 1943, with the outcome of the war still very much in doubt, the priority was to keep bombing, and that was exactly what Harris intended to do. Harris's next objective was Berlin, the big city, as it was known by the bomber crews. Harris believed that if he could destroy Berlin, he could end the war. It was a claim that would prove to be overly optimistic, but the campaign he launched against the German capital was nonetheless one of the most sustained and brutal aerial offensives of the war. Beginning on November the 18th and 19th, 1943, a total of 16 major raids were sent against Berlin. The German capital was a vast target, one of the largest cities in Europe, spread over hundreds of square miles, heavily defended by flak batteries and night fighters, and far deeper into German territory than Hamburg or the Ruhr cities. The crews who flew to Berlin faced the longest, most dangerous flights of the war, hours over hostile territory, through belts of searchlights and flak, hunted by night fighters that had grown increasingly sophisticated in their tactics. These raids devastated over 2,000 acres of Berlin, killed nearly 6,000 inhabitants, and rendered 1.5 million Germans homeless. The government district was hit, factories were destroyed, railway yards were torn apart, residential districts were reduced to rubble, but Berlin was simply too vast, too spread out, and too heavily defended to be destroyed the way Hamburg had been. The firestorm conditions that had consumed Hamburg could not be replicated in Berlin's wider streets and more modern construction. The cost to Bomber Command was not light. 492 bombers and their crews were listed as missing during the Berlin campaign. Each of those aircraft carried a crew of 7 men. The mathematics of loss were relentless and merciless. Nearly 3,500 young men killed, captured, or missing in action during a single campaign against a single city. It was a price that tested even Harris's iron resolve. For the crews who flew to Berlin night after night, the experience was a descent into a particular kind of hell. The route took them deep into Germany, across hundreds of miles of enemy territory defended by the most sophisticated air defenses in the world. The German night fighter force had evolved from a handful of improvised units into a highly effective killing machine, equipped with airborne radar and guided by a network of ground controllers who tracked the bomber stream with deadly accuracy. The flak over Berlin itself was the heaviest in Germany. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns ringed the city. The searchlights probed the sky in their dozens, sweeping back and forth, hunting for victims. The men who survived a full tour of 30 operations over Berlin considered themselves among the luckiest people alive. Statistically, they probably were. The point-blank plan, which had begun in early 1943, culminated in late February of 1944 in one of the most intense periods of bombing in the entire war. For 6 days and nights, Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force combined in what became known as the Big Week, dropping 16,506 tons of bombs on Germany. The targets were the aircraft factories, the engine plants, and the assembly lines that were producing the fighters that defended the Reich. The Big Week was a turning point in the air war over Europe. The combined weight of British night bombing and American daylight precision attacks inflicted severe damage on the German aircraft industry. But more importantly, the air battles fought during the Big Week drew the Luftwaffe's fighters into combat, where they were destroyed in large numbers. Germany could replace aircraft. It could not so easily replace the experienced pilots who flew them. In preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, a new directive came for Bomber Command in the spring of 1944. This was known as the Transportation Plan. Knowing how dependent the German armies were on the railways for moving troops, tanks, ammunition, and supplies, this was a plan for a major assault on the rail transport systems of Western Europe. The aim was to create a railway void between Western Germany and the French coast, so that when the invasion came, the Germans would be unable to rush reinforcements to the beachheads. This task was split between Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force. In all, from the opening assault until the final D-Day blow on the 2nd and 3rd of June, Bomber Command put in 69 such attacks. The damage caused was enormous. From Cologne and Aachen through Ghent and Courtrai to the centers around Paris and as far afield as Le Mans and Orléans, the railways became scenes of desolation. Marshalling yards were cratered. Locomotive sheds were destroyed, bridges were dropped into rivers. The rail network of northern France, which the Germans needed to function at full capacity, was reduced to chaos. The transportation plan was controversial. Some senior commanders argued that Bomber Command's heavy bombers were wasted on railway targets, that the strategic offensive against German industry should continue without interruption. Others worried about the inevitable French civilian casualties that would result from bombing railway centers in populated areas, but the results spoke for themselves. When the Allied armies stormed ashore on the 6th of June, 1944, the German ability to move reinforcements to Normandy was crippled. Panzer divisions that should have reached the beachheads within hours took days or even weeks, forced to make long detours around destroyed bridges and cratered junctions, harassed by Allied aircraft at every turn. The transportation plan had done exactly what it was designed to do. The German war machine was being brought to a standstill. Bomber Command continued its highly productive mine-laying operations, sowing the waters around German ports with thousands of magnetic and acoustic mines that sank shipping and closed harbors. They attacked U-boat pens with enormous tallboy bombs designed to penetrate the thick concrete roofs. They hit the coastal cities of Königsberg, Stettin, Bremen, Emden, Kiel, and Wilhelmshaven. By early 1945, German oil and fuel production had diminished to a relative trickle, starving the aircraft, tanks, and transports that were still desperately fighting on all fronts. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters sat impotent on their airfields. Without fuel, the panzer divisions that had once swept across Europe could barely move. Without fuel, the transport networks that kept the German armies supplied ground to a halt. Pilots who had been trained at great expense could not fly. Tanks that had been manufactured with enormous effort could not fight. The lifeblood of the German war machine was draining away, drop by drop, raid by raid, and there was nothing the German High Command could do to stop it. Harris continued to adhere to his personal conviction of area bombing of large industrial objectives, but even he acknowledged that the oil campaign was producing results that exceeded anything area bombing had achieved. The combination of the two approaches, area bombing to destroy industrial capacity and morale, precision attacks on oil to starve the war machine of fuel, created a cumulative effect that was, by early 1945, bringing Germany to its knees. Harris continued to adhere to his personal conviction of area bombing of large industrial objectives, but a new military situation was emerging. The successful Russian offensive, which had begun in mid-January of 1945, was driving westward through Poland and Silesia at a pace that astonished both sides. As the Russians advanced, it became apparent that air attacks on the East German cities which confronted them might be of powerful assistance to the Soviet drive. At the Allied conference at Yalta, The Russians requested Allied cooperation in the mass bombing of all communications in eastern Germany to prevent any reinforcement of the German Eastern Front. They wanted these attacks within an agreed bomb line to keep the British and American air forces away from any territory they might soon occupy. Following a few days of bad weather, on the 13th of February, 1945, Bomber Command was ready for the assault on an unsuspecting German city, a city that, until this night, had been largely spared the devastation that had consumed so many others. A city of Baroque architecture and porcelain factories, of art galleries and churches, of refugees fleeing the advancing Russian armies. A city that had come to believe, with a faith that proved tragically misplaced, that it was too beautiful, too culturally significant, too far from the industrial heartland to be a target. The city was Dresden. After a 10-hour flight, the first wave of bombers approached the city in the darkness of a winter's night. The city below was ill-prepared for its fate. Its anti-aircraft defenses were minimal. Its fire services were not equipped for a major raid. The resulting fires could be seen from a distance of 80 kilometers. As at Hamburg, the incendiaries created a firestorm that consumed entire districts. The city, packed with refugees who had fled westward from the Russian advance, was a tinderbox. The narrow medieval streets and timber-framed buildings fed the flames, and the firestorm generated its own terrible winds, drawing oxygen from the shelters below and replacing it with smoke and carbon monoxide. Many people had died in the shelters under the crushing weight of fallen masonry. Many more were trapped, but the rescue workers could not reach them in time, and hundreds perished from asphyxiation. In the days that followed, the photographs from Dresden circled the world: the ruined Frauenkirche, the blackened skeleton of the city center, the long lines of corpses laid out in the streets for identification. For the first time, serious questions were being asked not just by the enemy, but by the Allied press and public about whether the strategic bombing campaign had crossed a line, whether the destruction of a city of such cultural significance, so late in a war that was clearly already won, could be justified by any military logic. Even Churchill, who had been one of the strongest advocates of strategic bombing throughout the war, distanced himself from Dresden in its aftermath. The moral reckoning that the bombing campaign had been deferring for years had finally arrived, and it would cast a shadow over the legacy of Bomber Command that persists to this day. The bombing of Dresden ignited a debate that has never been resolved. Was it militarily justified? Was it a legitimate attack on a transportation hub through which German reinforcements were flowing to the Eastern Front? Or was it an act of wanton destruction against a city of no significant military value, filled with refugees and civilians? What is beyond dispute is the scale of what Bomber Command achieved over the course of the war, and the price it paid. From those first, fumbling raids of 1939, when a handful of obsolete aircraft ventured tentatively over the North Sea, to the 1,000-bomber raids over Cologne and the firestorms over Hamburg and Dresden, Bomber Command underwent a transformation without parallel in military history. The force that Arthur Harris commanded by 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the one that had existed when war broke out. The small formations of 30 or 40 aircraft had given way to streams of 1,000 or more. The crude, inaccurate bombing of 1940 had evolved into the sophisticated Pathfinder-led, marker-guided attacks of 1944. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany remains one of the most debated aspects of the Second World War. Its proponents argue that it diverted enormous German resources into air defense, thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have been used on the Eastern Front, hundreds of fighter aircraft that could have opposed the Allied armies, millions of man-hours devoted to repair and civil defense, rather than war production. They argue that the destruction of oil production, transportation networks, and industrial capacity shortened the war by months, perhaps years, and saved countless lives on all sides. Its critics point to the civilian casualties, the hundreds of thousands of German men, women, and children who died under the bombs. They point to cities like Dresden and Hamburg, where the destruction seemed to go far beyond any military necessity. They argue that the resources devoted to strategic bombing might have been better used elsewhere, and that the campaign's moral cost was too high. In a place that offers comfort to no one, What cannot be disputed is the courage of the men who flew the missions. Night after night, they climbed into their Lancasters and Halifaxes and Mosquitoes and flew into the darkness, knowing that the odds were against them, knowing that on any given night, the searchlights might find them, the flak might hit them, the night fighters might catch them. They flew in freezing temperatures at 20,000 feet, in unpressurized cabins, wearing oxygen masks, watching for the telltale exhaust flame of a night fighter closing from behind. Many of them were barely out of their teens. They came from Britain, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from the Caribbean, from every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond. They volunteered for the most dangerous job in the Allied forces, and nearly half of them did not come home. The 10th of May, 1940. German forces pour across the borders of the Low Countries and into France. The phony war, that strange, suspended period of minor air and sea clashes that had drifted on since the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, is over. In its place, a devastating and very real war. Within a month, the British Expeditionary Force has been driven back across the English Channel from the beaches of Dunkirk. Shortly after, France surrenders. Britain stands alone. Her army is battered. Her navy is stretched thin. And the question that hangs over every war room and every kitchen table is the same. How do we fight back? The answer, for the time being, is the only one available: from the air. A bomber offensive is about to begin. It will last almost 5 years, from May 1940 until April 1945. Bomber Command of the Royal Air Force, joined in 1943 by the heavy bombers of the 8th and 15th United States Army Air Forces, will attack cities, factories, and communication networks across Germany. It will become one of the most sustained, costly, and controversial campaigns in the history of warfare. And it will be fought, night after night and day after day, by young men who climbed into vibrating, freezing aircraft and flew for hours through darkness and flak, and fighter attack toward cities they had never seen and would never visit on the ground. It was a war unlike any that had come before, industrial in its scale, intimate in its terror, and relentless in its demand for sacrifice. As one veteran would later reflect, in the bomber war, the tactics changed from night to night, and always something new going on. It was a fluid war. The whole time they think of something, and we thought of something. But the rationale for this onslaught did not begin in 1940. It went back 30 years, to the Great War of 1914 to 1918, when military air power first demonstrated that armed conflict would no longer be confined to land and sea. Soon after that war ended, military theorists and enthusiasts began to dream of bombing as the decisive element in future conflicts. Victory, they argued, would be achieved by strategic bombing. The most extreme advocates went further still. Air power alone could win a war, they said, a preemptive strike that would render armies and navies irrelevant. They called it the knockout blow. In the early years of the First World War, aircraft could only bomb the battlefield. That was known as tactical bombing. But gradually, as bomb loads grew heavier and ranges extended, aircraft could reach beyond the front lines. That was called strategic bombing, and it evolved into a twin policy, hitting industrial targets and undermining the morale of the civilian population. The aim was to destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war and the will of its people to support it. In Britain, strategic bombing became central to a critical debate about the future of air power. On the 1st of April, 1918, the independent Royal Air Force had been formed from the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. The ability of bombers to make an entirely separate contribution to warfare became the cornerstone of RAF doctrine. Sir Hugh Trenchard, the chief of the air staff, argued forcefully that the moral effect of bombing outweighed its physical effects by 20 to 1. There can be no doubt, he insisted, that we must be prepared for long-distance aerial operations against an enemy's main base of supply. He persuaded influential politicians that he was right, and the independent RAF, which some had wanted disbanded, survived. Trenchard also convinced ministers that bombers could keep order in rebellious territories like Iraq and the northwest frontier of India at far less cost than the army. The tactic of imperial policing, as it became known, further enhanced the reputation of RAF bombers and persuaded theorists and staff officers that they really could achieve decisive results. By 1923, the RAF held that, to defend the United Kingdom, 2/3 of its aircraft should be bombers, able to harass an enemy's homeland. Given all of this, a statement made in 1932 by the cabinet minister Stanley Baldwin hardly seemed far-fetched. "The bomber," Baldwin declared, "will always get through." No defense against the modern aircraft with its longer range, its large bomb-carrying capacity, its defensive gunners, its greater accuracy of navigation and improved bombing techniques seemed possible. Baldwin's words entered the public consciousness and stayed there. They shaped not only military planning but the fears of ordinary citizens. In the years that followed, the assumption that the bomber would always get through became an article of faith, one that would underpin every major decision about British air strategy for the next decade. It was a prophecy that carried within it both a promise and a warning. Of course, this also applied to Britain, and there were those who saw the danger ahead. Winston Churchill warned of the most frightful scenes of ruin and slaughter that would befall Britain as a result of massive air raids at the outbreak of war. By 1937, war with Hitler's Germany was becoming increasingly likely. While the diplomatic wrangling continued, the RAF prepared for the worst by drawing up the Western air plans. These were based not only on the assumption that the bomber would always get through, but that it would accurately locate and attack its designated target. A further presumption was that this could be achieved in daylight, by bombers flying in formation to provide mutual protection with their massed guns against enemy fighters. The air staff laid out a series of plans to attack 15 groups of targets, known collectively as the Western Air Plans. One of those plans, Western Air Plan 5, aimed to strike at the Ruhr specifically, 19 power plants and 26 coking plants, with the idea of paralyzing German war industry. To achieve this, it was planned that 3,000 sorties would be launched in a fortnight. The calculated cost, just 176 bombers lost. That, they believed, would be enough to paralyze the Germans. Across the Atlantic, the United States had reached similar conclusions. President Roosevelt was increasingly concerned about Germany's expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and foresaw that American involvement in Europe would be necessary to check Hitler's territorial ambitions. Roosevelt was also acutely aware of the strength of the German Luftwaffe. In January 1939, he warned Congress that our existing air forces are so utterly inadequate that they must be strengthened, and persuaded it that 5,500 combat aircraft should be made available by June of 1941. When the Germans invaded Poland 9 months later, the American Air Corps' defensive role was extended to cover the entire Western Hemisphere. Long-range aircraft would be essential. A Martin B-10 had flown non-stop from Alaska to Seattle in 1934, and despite lukewarm official support, its success prompted Boeing to develop a 4-engined military prototype based on a civilian transport design. It was designated the YB-17, and the Flying Fortress was born. The Consolidated Aircraft Company's B-24 Liberator soon followed it into the air. These were the famous aircraft that would later see action over Germany. Both bombers were heavily defended with machine guns. They also made use of a liquid oxygen system and the Norden bomb sight, which would enable them to bomb from high altitude. The B-17 carried so many machine guns compared with other aircraft that it earned its famous name, the Flying Fortress. And from this, the idea was born that the B-17 and the B-24 could be self-defending bombers. But although the RAF flew a handful of Flying Fortresses operationally, no American bomber unit would operate in the European theater for almost another 3 years. Meanwhile, the RAF had already put the theory of daylight bombing into practice, and it was about to learn its first brutal lessons. In 1939, the RAF went to war with 4 twin-engined bombers, the Blenheim, the Hampton, the Wellington, and the Whitley. The Blenheim could carry only 1,000 pounds of bombs. The Whitley could carry 7,000, but the drawback was the same for all of them. They were not heavily defended with machine guns, and they flew at roughly 250 miles an hour, making them desperately vulnerable to German fighters. Any notion that they could act as self-defending bombers was about to be destroyed. The British soon learned that their bombers were easy prey for the 350-mile-an-hour Messerschmitt Bf 109. The concept of daylight precision bombing, even in tight defensive formation, was distinctly flawed. Losses were simply unsustainable. On the 4th of September, 5 Blenheims went down. On the 18th of December, 1939, 12 out of 22 Wellingtons failed to return from attacks on enemy shipping. Another painful lesson came in May of 1940, when formations of battles and Blenheims suffered grievous losses and, in some cases, total annihilation over France. There was little hope of improvement. During the Funny War, Whitley bombers had ranged freely at night over Germany, dropping leaflets. The ease of those flights encouraged the RAF to lower, in a surprising degree, their opinion of the opposition they expected to meet. But now, shaken by the scale of carnage among the daylight bombers, the British opted for night bombing. Once the air campaign began in earnest on the 15th of May, 1940, 99 bombers attacked oil and transport targets in the Ruhr, signaling the beginning of the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. Night bombing proved less costly in aircraft and men, but it was worryingly inaccurate. Photographic reconnaissance showed that 2 night raids in December of 1940, by a total of 296 bombers, that dropped 262 tons of bombs on 2 Gelsenkirchen synthetic oil plants had done no obvious damage. By April of 1941, the predicted average bombing error of 300 yards at night had been raised to 1,000 yards. As a consequence, a major change in bombing policy was agreed. The air staff decided that, for approximately 3/4 of each month, it was only possible to obtain satisfactory results by carrying out what they called a blitz attack on large, working-class and industrial areas in towns. The dream of surgical precision was quietly being abandoned, and then came the evidence that confirmed the worst fears. 28 raids were analyzed, and their photographs examined. In August of 1941, a civil servant named D.M. Butt, a member of the Cabinet Secretariat, produced a report based on these findings. The news was devastating. Of all the aircraft on those raids that reported attacking their targets, overall, including the occupied countries, only 1/3 had gotten within 5 miles of their target. Over Germany, that figure dropped to 1 in 4. In the Ruhr, 1 in 10. On moonless nights in the Ruhr, just 1 in 15. Only within 5 miles of their target. Not on it, not near it, 5 miles away. The Butt report was a watershed. It demolished the comfortable assumptions that had sustained the bombing campaign and laid bare a devastating truth. Bomber Command was, in effect, missing entire cities. The navigation technology of the time, the darkness, the weather, the stress of flying through hostile skies, all of it conspired to make precision at night a near impossibility. The crews were brave, but bravery alone could not overcome the laws of physics. Apart from navigational problems, RAF bombers began to suffer heavy losses, such as the night of the 7th to the 8th of November, 1941, when 37 out of 400 were shot down. The winter months brought little improvement, and so, when Air Marshal Arthur Harris became Air Officer commanding RAF Bomber Command in February of 1942, he faced immediate calls for resources to be diverted away from the bombing campaign altogether. Harris was a veteran of Imperial policing and an admirer of Trenchard. He had previously commanded No. 5 Bomber Group and served as Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. In his new post, he vigorously supported a strong bombing campaign against Germany and resisted any attempt to reduce the resources at his disposal. Air Ministry orders to carry out area bombing, the euphemism for the bombing of built-up areas, predated his appointment. But professionally and personally, Harris fully supported the policy and pressed relentlessly for more heavy bombers to carry it out. Harris was helped by the fact that the 4-engine bombers, planned back in 1936 when war was seen as inevitable, were now at last coming into service. The first to arrive, in February of 1941, was the Sterling, with a bomb capacity of 14,000 pounds. It was followed just a month later by the Halifax, which could carry 13,000 pounds. But it was not until a full year after that, in March of 1942, that the third of the heavy bombers appeared, and it turned out to be the most successful of them all. The Lancaster entered operation with the capacity to carry 22,000 pounds of bombs. These new heavies had 2 or 3 times the load capacity of the twin-engine bombers that Bomber Command had gone to war with. With these new aircraft, Harris set out to take the war into Germany's backyard, and the results were immediate. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, admitted that enormous damage had been done to the Baltic port of Lübeck on the 28th and 29th of March, 1942, where 200 acres were laid waste. Then came the most audacious strike yet. On the 30th of May, 1942, 1,046 bombers, struck Cologne in the celebrated 1,000-bomber raid. One veteran remembered it vividly. "We went to Cologne and back, and we were opposed by searchlights, fighters, and flak," he recalled. The bomb aimer's doing his best to get his bomb sight on the target, and you're doing your best to keep the aeroplane flying straight and level. And you eventually get to the target area, and the pathfinders will be there dropping their flares, and then the bombs would go. And when you got rid of a load of bombs like 12,000 pounds, the aeroplane certainly knew about it. Jumped up like a bucking bronco, really. But the spectacular successes masked a persistent problem. Raids on Essen in March and April showed that only 10% of bombers got within 5 miles of their target. Despite the attempt to swamp German defenses by concentrating aircraft in a bomber stream, losses continued to rise. From August to October, Bomber Command suffered a 5.3% loss rate. During 1942, 1,235 bombers were lost and 2,839 damaged. The introduction of improved navigational aids raised hopes of lowering losses and improving accuracy. The Butt Report of August 1941 had given the RAF an enormous shock, and that shock provided the impetus for developing better navigational and bombing aids. The first to come into operation, in March of 1942, was something called G, a directional radio beam that enabled the navigator to fix his position over the continent. One navigator recalled the reality. "In my day, we had G, this marvelous radar navigation aid, but it quickly ran, the Germans jammed it, and I had a Canadian navigator. When we got to about the middle of the channel, he'd say, 'Lend me a flashlight early,' and that, to me, meant the end of that sort of navigation for the night, because it meant he was changing the channel. If he changed the channel, the next one wasn't going to be much good either. So then you were back to almost basics, and we seemed to get there somehow. I don't know how we did it. I think we did it by feel." Despite the introduction of new aids, precision bombing was still not possible for main force squadrons. The accuracy of specialist operations, such as the spectacular Dam Busters raid, simply could not be replicated on a large scale. On the night of the 16th to the 17th of May, 1943, 16 Lancasters of 617 Squadron attacked 6 German dams, destroying 2 and damaging 1. The German official Hans Rumpf called it precision bombing of the highest order. It showed that precision targets could be hit at night, even in areas that were extremely difficult to locate. The dams were tucked away in valleys, in wooded areas of the Ruhr and the Eder valleys. But to achieve it, you had to form a special squadron, train them in a particular way, and equip them with a special bomb. It was impossible to carry this out for main force operations, but it set a standard. Area bombing of towns and cities remained the norm. Harris regarded the Dam Busters raid as one episode in the broader Battle of the Ruhr, which lasted from March to July of 1943. When 43 heavy raids were launched against Essen, Duisburg, Dortmund, and Bochum. And then, during July and August, came Hamburg. 4 night raids on Hamburg caused what the German fire chief called gigantic damage, and what Harris himself described as unimaginable destruction. 791 RAF bombers attacked Hamburg, and the results were devastating. The searchlights could not pick the bombers out. The guns could not focus on them. The night fighters, as one pilot put it, went around chasing their own tails. The reason was a device called window. Strips of metallic foil, dropped in bundles from the bombers, interfered with the German radar transmissions. Major General Kamhuber, responsible for the German defenses, was blunt in his assessment. Window, he said, had made them blind. The effect was extraordinary. In a single stroke, the elaborate German defense system, the searchlights, the radar-directed flak guns, the night fighters guided to their prey by ground controllers, was rendered useless. The sky above Hamburg, which should have been a death trap for the bombers, became instead a scene of almost unopposed devastation. The technology of a handful of metallic strips had overturned years of German investment in air defense. For the civilians below, it was an apocalypse. The raids created a firestorm, a phenomenon in which individual fires merged into a single, colossal inferno that generated winds of hurricane force, sucking air and everything in its path toward the center. Survivors would describe fire from the sky. Streets turned to rivers of flame, entire families fleeing with nowhere to go, parents searching desperately for children in streets they could no longer recognize. The temperatures at the heart of the firestorm exceeded 1,000 degrees. Asphalt melted. People were incinerated where they stood. Those who had sought shelter in cellars suffocated as the firestorm consumed every molecule of oxygen above them. Operations like Hamburg illustrated that area bombing was still the only real option for RAF Bomber Command. At the end of 1943, the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Portal, reflected ruefully that if it had been tactically possible to concentrate a quarter of Bomber Command's total bombs dropped on Germany on a distinct group of targets associated with oil, ball bearings, or aero engines, the war would by then have been won, but the losses were not diminishing. In the period from November 1943 to March 1944, during 35 night raids, RAF Bomber Command lost 1,047 bombers. Each carried 7 men. A further 1,682 were damaged. On each of the 16 visits to Berlin, an average of 29 bombers were lost. And then came Nuremberg. On the 30th of March, 1944, 795 bombers were dispatched. 95 aircraft, carrying 655 men, were lost. 71 more were damaged. These frightening figures were a brutal reminder that neither Germany nor the Luftwaffe were yet beaten. Nuremberg was the worst night of the entire bomber war. In a matter of hours, more men were killed than in many ground battles that lasted weeks. The losses fell disproportionately on individual squadrons. Some lost a quarter or even a third of their aircraft in that single night. For those who survived and returned to their airfields in the gray English dawn, the empty dispersal points where aircraft should have been parked told their own story. One veteran captured the constant terror. You had to be on the alert almost from the time you left the English coast. You'd see people shot down before they'd even got to the Dutch coast. And then you'd get through that lot. And then the searchlights and the flak. And the fighters were the main problem, really. If you've got a fighter up your backside when you're on the bombing run, no way are you going to just fly straight and level. And sometimes Frankfurt, it was like Piccadilly Circus up there. You'd see Lancasters, Halifaxes, 109s, everything going hither and thither. That image of a crowded, chaotic sky lit by fire and tracer and exploding aircraft, where collision was as real a threat as combat, was one that haunted many veterans for the rest of their lives. The bomber stream, designed to concentrate aircraft for safety, also concentrated the danger. Hundreds of aircraft, each carrying thousands of pounds of high explosives and incendiaries, flew within yards of one another through a sky filled with shrapnel and burning debris. It was as close to a vision of hell as most of those young men would ever come. While the RAF fought its night war, the United States Army Air Force entered the conflict wedded to its own doctrine: precision bombing in daylight, by self-defending bombers, from a minimum altitude of 24,000 feet. They had been encouraged by excellent results in practice, results that led to confident claims that American crews could place bombs in a pickle barrel. In June of 1942, the 8th Army Air Force began to congregate in England. They arrived equipped with 2 heavy bombers. The B-17E, the Flying Fortress, carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns with a range of 1,000 yards and a bomb capacity of 5,000 pounds, crewed by 10 men. The other was the B-24D, the Liberator, also with a crew of 10. It carried 10 machine guns, 4 of them in power-operated turrets, and could haul 8,000 pounds of bombs. Both aircraft theoretically had a top speed of 300 miles per hour, but in action, they flew at about 180. The first B-17S did not reach the 8th Army Air Force in England until July of 1942, and the numbers built up slowly. By the close of that year, 200 B-17S and 100 B-24S had crossed the Atlantic. Unlike RAF personnel, whose night operations meant evening briefings, the Americans rose in the chill of a misty dawn to prepare for a morning takeoff. There was a ritual to it that became grimly familiar: the wake-up call in the darkness, the mess hall breakfast that many could not eat, the briefing room where a curtain was pulled back to reveal the day's target, and the long red ribbon stretching deep into Germany. The length of that ribbon told you everything you needed to know about your chances of coming home. The first 6 months of action found the American crews gaining experience over the occupied countries of Western Europe, relatively short missions that allowed them to test their tactics and their nerve before the real ordeal began. That changed in January of 1943. An Anglo-American conference at Casablanca agreed on the launching of a coordinated combined bomber offensive. Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, the 8th's commanding general, resisted British attempts to switch his force to night bombing. He drew up the Eaker plan for his bombers to attack 76 specific targets connected with industries vital to the German armed forces. It was agreed that the Americans would bomb selected targets in Germany by day, but during February of 1943, they were able to mount only 2 operations blocked either by adverse weather or a lack of serviceable aircraft. And like the RAF before them, the Americans soon learned that the self-defending bomber was little more than a pipe dream. Operating from England, protective fighter escorts had only enough fuel to reach the German border before they had to turn back. They would meet the bombers in the same area to guide them home, but by then, many had already perished. On the 17th of April, 115 aircraft attacked Bremen. 16 were shot down and 44 damaged. 22 out of 60 were lost against Kiel in June, and 6 missions flown during Blitz Week in July cost over 100 aircraft. By the close of July 1943, 8th Bomber Command had only 275 operational 4-engined bombers left. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commander of the 305th Bombardment Group, developed a complicated defensive formation in an effort to reduce losses. LeMay's idea was based upon the element of 3. Each squadron had 4 elements of 3 aircraft, each flying in an arrowhead, the lead aircraft with one just behind and to the right, and another just below and to the left. He built that up into a squadron, then into a group box. That was known as the combat box of a bombardment group, all based upon the principle of an arrowhead, one high, one low, spread over 3,000 feet. The idea was that it would provide mutual defense for all 3 bombardment groups in a big wing combat box. But the Germans attacked these combat boxes with a bewildering range of tactics, boosted by the fact that their fighters could refuel quickly and return to the fray. They used an airborne controller who stayed out of range and directed the attacks. The assaults were carried out by single-engine fighters in pairs, singly, or even in squadron formation from the front and from the flanks. Occasionally, they came from above, diving out of the sun or the cloud, or from underneath in what was called a belly-up attack. And to add to the chaos, the Germans placed Junkers 87 Stukas, or Junkers 88 above the bomber stream, dropping fragmentation bombs or parachute bombs onto the formations below. To complete the onslaught, twin-engined fighter bombers like the Messerschmitt 110 lobbed rockets from out of range in the rear. It was a great battle, every single time the Americans went to war over Germany. The scale of the losses was staggering. On the 17th of August, 1943, in a combined mission against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, 60 bombers and 600 men went down. One gunner from the Schweinfurt mission later recalled, "We thought we were as hard as nails. After all, we were a combat crew. But right then, we felt like 90-year-old men." In the wake of these disasters, the 8th Army Air Force could not mount a single mission. The British renewed their pressure for a switch to night bombing, but the time needed to retrain the entire system, perhaps as long as 2 years, meant the option was ruled out. The bloodletting continued. On the 6th of September, 45 B-17s were lost in a mission to Stuttgart. Between the 8th and 10th of October, a further 88 bombers went down, and on the 14th of October, 291 bombers returned to Schweinfurt, where another 60 B-17s were lost. There was no other choice. Unescorted deep penetration missions into Germany were suspended. 1944 opened more brightly for the Allies, as further improvements in navigational aids and the appearance of a new fighter raised hopes. The P-51B Mustang came into operation in December of 1943. It carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns, could travel at 400 miles per hour, making it capable of coping with any German fighter then in existence, and had a range of 700 miles, which could be doubled with drop tanks. Reputedly, when Hermann Goering saw a Mustang over Berlin in December of 1943, he said simply, "We have lost the war." In February of 1944, 8th Bomber Command flew 2,680 B-17 and 917 B-24 sorties into Germany for the loss of 187 bombers, with another 24 subsequently written off. But the most important statistic of all concerned a single mission. On the 29th of February, 218 B-17S flew to Brunswick, protected by 550 P-47S, P-38S, and Mustangs. Only one bomber was lost. The Americans had proved that they could successfully fight their way to and from a primary target deep inside Germany. In March of 1944, the loss rate dropped to 3.5%, a vast improvement on the 9.1% recorded in October of '43. And to add to the increasing pressure on Germany, on the 20th of February, the 15th Army Air Force in Italy, under Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, was ready to bomb targets in the south of the country. Spaatz had been appointed Commanding General of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe in January of 1944. During Big Week in February of 1944, the 8th and 15th Army Air Forces together sent an average of 1,000 bombers each day against German targets. Spaatz and Harris were convinced that they were at last on the verge of achieving the destruction and dislocation of the German war industries, called for by the Casablanca Directive of January 1943. Big Week was a statement of intent. For the first time, the Allies had the aircraft, the crews, and the fighter escort to sustain a concentrated campaign against German industry day after day. The factories that produced German fighters were targeted with particular ferocity. The logic was ruthless but sound. Destroy the fighters on the ground and in the factories, and the bombers would have an ever easier time destroying everything else. It was attrition by design, and it was working. But then the D-Day planners stepped in, demanding that the heavy bombers be allocated to their needs. From April to September of 1944, the strategic bombing forces were placed under the control of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Although the attacks on German industrial targets became less frequent, they did not altogether cease, and Spaatz, in particular, remained convinced that an oil offensive was the key to final victory. On the 12th of May, 935 8th Bomber Command aircraft were sent against 6 oil plants, at a cost of 46 bombers lost. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe fighter commander, confirmed that the lack of aviation fuel was now restricting Luftwaffe activity. And yet for individual crews, the war remained a dangerous, terrifying business. One pilot described what it was like to be caught in searchlights. One of the most frightening experiences I had was being caught in searchlights. You're sitting there, and suddenly flash a light hits you, and then the others come, and you're in a cone, in a split second. Then you've got to get out of it, if you can. And that's not easy, because you can quite easily lose control of the aircraft or crash it. You feel very exposed. You're like a bird in a cage. You concentrate only on the instruments. Luckily, I got out and lived to tell the tale. A lot of people didn't. It was the establishment of Allied air bases on the continent, once the Normandy bridgehead had been consolidated, that allowed bombers to operate with massive fighter support. The German defenses suffered heavily, making life somewhat easier for both the day and night bomber crews. A British loss rate of 11% in June dropped to 3.7% in August. The difference was felt immediately by the men who flew. For over a year, every mission into Germany had been a gauntlet. Now, with fighters swarming around them in numbers the Luftwaffe could no longer match, the bomber crews began to feel something that had been dangerous to feel before, a sense that they might actually survive the war. The balance of power in the skies over Europe had shifted decisively. The tonnage figures tell the story. During July and August of 1944, RAF Bomber Command dropped 120,000 tons of bombs on German targets, compared with 37,000 tons in the same months a year earlier. The 8th Bomber Command dropped 85,000 tons during the same period. But there were still disagreements over bombing tactics. Spaatz continued to favor attacks on oil plants. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, thought transportation targets more important. Harris favored area bombing of cities. Inevitably, a compromise was reached. Even after the Strategic Air Forces reverted to national control in September, the targets were split. During the last 3 months of 1944, 53% of RAF Bomber Command's tonnage fell on cities, 15% on transportation, 14% on oil, and the rest in direct support of military and naval operations, including the sinking of the battleship Tirpitz, while at anchor in Norway on the 12th of November. Historians would later conclude that by late 1944, the Allies had achieved command of the air over Germany. But at the time, the bomber crews might not have agreed. Despite their increasing successes, They continued to face the dangers posed by a determined German defense, now worryingly enhanced by a terrifying new threat, the German jet fighter. For all the statistics and the tonnage figures and the strategic debates conducted in war rooms far from the front, the air war over Germany in late 1944 remained, for the individual crew member, an intensely personal ordeal. The flak had not stopped. The night fighters had not disappeared. The cold at 20,000 feet still froze exposed flesh to metal. The oxygen masks still iced over. The fear was still there, every single time. And even as the Allies gained the upper hand, young men continued to die in numbers that would have been considered catastrophic in any other branch of the armed services. The Messerschmitt Me 262 had a speed of 540 miles per hour, considerably faster than even the Mustang, and carried 4 30mm cannon, which, if they got within range, were extremely lethal. The Me-163 Comet, the rocket-propelled fighter known to bomber crews as the powered egg because of its bulbous shape, also carried 30mm cannon and was capable of 600 miles per hour. More alarmingly, it could reach 30,000 feet in just 2.5 minutes. But the jets suffered badly from mechanical failure and had very short endurance. The rocket-powered 163 could essentially only go up and make one quick pass before gliding back down again. Their numbers were too few and their reliability too poor to turn the tide. But the fanaticism of their pilots was not in question. On the 4th of April, 1945, flying an Mi-262 that had run out of ammunition while defending a raid on Berlin, Major Heinrich Erler broadcast his intention of ramming an American bomber to ground control. His final words were chilling: "We'll meet again in Valhalla." During the closing months of the war, the neat distinctions between American precision bombing and British area bombing had blurred almost beyond recognition. The Americans did not exclusively attack precision targets, nor the RAF cities. Neither stuck solely to day or night bombing. On the 3rd of February, 1945, nearly 1,000 flying fortresses bombed Berlin. 3 days later, 8th Bomber Command attacked Magdeburg and Chemnitz. Round-the-clock bombing. During the first quarter of 1945, the Ruhr became virtually isolated through the destruction of its transport system. The Bielefeld railway viaduct was spectacularly smashed by a Grand Slam bomb devised by Barnes-Wallis, the same man who had created the bouncing bomb that breached the dams in 1943. The Grand Slam, weighing 10 tons, was the largest bomb used in the war. When it struck the earth, it penetrated deep underground before detonating, creating a seismic shockwave that could collapse bridges and viaducts from below. It was a weapon of extraordinary destructive precision, and it symbolized how far the bombing campaign had come from the days when crews could not get within 5 miles of their target. From January to May of 1945, the 8th Army Air Force alone dropped over 370,000 tons of bombs. The RAF flew 67,483 sorties. By April of 1945, Germany's main transport networks, oil production facilities, and urban centers had all been severely damaged. Her ability to wage war was, at last, fatally undermined. But the cost of the air offensive had been staggering. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,573 aircrew during the Second World War. The great majority died during operations over Germany. With casualties among escorting fighters, the United States Army Air Force suffered 43,742 killed and 1,923 seriously wounded. Those numbers, together, approach 100,000 men. Each one had a name. Each one had a family waiting at home. Each one had a life they expected to resume when the war was over. The loss rate of RAF Bomber Command was, proportionally, among the highest of any branch of the Allied armed forces. A crew member beginning a tour of 30 operations in 1943 faced, statistically, less than an even chance of surviving it. Many did not make it past their 5th mission. The phrase operational tour became a euphemism for a protracted gamble with death, one that lasted months and offered no respite, no safe ground, no place to hide. The question that followed them all was inevitable. Had it been worthwhile? Was strategic bombing effective? Post-war analysts, including some who helped to compile the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, claimed that only 10% of damage had been done by the strategic bombing campaign to German war industry. This was vigorously challenged. The 10% figure was an overall number. It did not account for the specific, devastating damage done to synthetic oil plants or steel production. Moreover, it did not consider what would have happened if no bombing had taken place at all. It was proved that the Germans had a 20% slack in their industrial capacity at the beginning of the war. If that slack had been fully taken up without interference from the air, the Germans would have produced far more war material than they did, so the 10% figure told only part of the story. From 1943 onwards, the Allied air offensive forced the Germans to withdraw aircraft, troops, and equipment from other theaters of war to defend their homeland. The figures show this to be a fact. Between July and October of 1943, the total Luftwaffe aircraft strength on the Western Front rose from 1,687 to 2,097, while its overall strength actually dropped from 5,396 to 4,830. Germany was being forced to defend its skies at the expense of every other front. Winston Churchill used the strategic bombing of Germany to persuade Joseph Stalin that a second front had been opened in the West, and to help President Roosevelt resist calls for the European theater to be wound down in favor of the Pacific. The strategic bombing campaign paved the way for Allied troops from East and West to converge on Berlin and ensure the overthrow of Hitler and his Nazi regime. The debate over strategic bombing's effectiveness is, in many ways, inseparable from the debate over its morality. The men who planned it believed they were shortening the war and saving lives, Allied lives certainly, but also, they argued, the lives that would have been lost in a prolonged ground campaign. The men who carried it out had no time for such abstractions. They were young men doing a dangerous job because their countries asked them to. The civilians who died beneath the bombs had no say in the matter at all. What can be said with certainty is this: the combined bomber offensive forced Germany to fight a war on three dimensions: on the ground, at sea, and now, incessantly, in the air above its own cities and factories. It diverted resources, disrupted production, shattered infrastructure, and imposed a cumulative toll that, by the spring of 1945, had left the Third Reich unable to function as a modern industrial state. In the bomber war, everything changed from night to night. The tactics changed, the technology changed, the targets changed. As one veteran put it, always something new going on. A chap who operated in 1942 would have a completely different story from one who flew in 44. It was a fluid war. The whole time they think of something, and we thought of something. It was a war fought at altitude and in darkness, at speeds that seem almost quaint by modern standards, but that felt, to the men inside those shaking, freezing, roaring aircraft, like the very edge of what human beings could endure. They flew into curtains of flak and forests of searchlights. They watched other bombers explode in midair, knowing that the men inside had been their friends at breakfast. They navigated by feel when the instruments failed. They dropped their bombs and turned for home, never certain they would make it. Some were barely out of school. Some were fathers. Some were volunteers who had crossed oceans to fight a war that was not yet their own. They came from the towns and farms of England, Scotland, Wales, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the West Indies, and the United States. They spoke different dialects, held different faiths, and dreamed different dreams. What they shared was a willingness to climb into a bomber and fly into the dark. The average age of a Bomber Command crew member was 22. Many were younger. They were boys, really, asked to do the work of men in circumstances that would have tested the strongest nerves on Earth. They lived in a world of strange contradictions, sleeping in beds with sheets, eating in mess halls, cycling to their aircraft on country lanes past hedgerows and grazing cattle, and then, within an hour, flying through a sky filled with fire and death. They would return, if they returned, to bacon and eggs, and a debrief, and the empty chairs of friends who had not come back. And the next night, or the next morning, they would do it all again. 55,573 men of RAF Bomber Command did not come home. 43,742 Americans perished. Behind every one of those numbers is a human being who had a favorite song, who wrote letters home, who carried a photograph in a breast pocket, who was afraid and went anyway.